right now it's just gone 7:30 in Alice Springs, where about 90 minutes ago a curfew came into effect. We'll cross to Matt Cunningham, who is live on the streets in literally a couple of minutes' time. But first, well, the signs of aggro and stress that were there at the end of last year are back for the Prime Minister and were there for all to see. As you know, when it comes to the headlines this week, before we even get to Clueless Claire, and I've got plenty to say about her today and the idiot immigration minister, you know that according to Newspoll, they're headed towards a minority government. According to the Roy Morgan poll, it's currently 50-50, and even in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, the personal ratings for the Prime Minister are starting to take a dive. In fact, when you have a look here, you can see that 49% of voters, when asked to have a look at the Prime Minister's performance over the past few weeks, well, 49% say poor or very poor. On the far right of the screen, you'll see those little squiggle marks. The two at the top are people who've said good or very good. That's going down. The people who are saying poor or very poor has been going up and going up for some time. Now, in part, something that absolutely exemplifies how cranky this Prime Minister is right now and how out of touch he is right now is the situation that has been building for some time but hit a crescendo in the past couple of days, and that is the issues in and around Alice Springs. Now, Sky News Primetime has been relentless in having a look at this story because it's the citizens, no matter of what background they have, but it's the citizens of Alice Springs that are living in fear. There is many deep social problems that need to be dealt with. But before you can even start to get into the root cause, you've got to deal with the consequences. And the consequences, of course, is youth crime. This was $30,000 worth of damage being done to a local tavern in the afternoon. Now, the two peaks of violence happen in the late afternoon and the beginnings of dusk. That is not affected by the curfew that was announced today. But again, back at 3 a.m, that, of course, will be affected. Now, the Prime Minister, we know, has no interest in what is happening in Alice Springs, which is why the alternative Prime Minister, Peter Dutton, had this question for him today.
Since being elected, the Prime Minister has spent just 4 hours in Alice Springs. At the moment, local residents, business owners, school principals and the Mayor have all been pleading for support from you, Prime Minister. Yet locals have seen little evidence of the $250 million package that you promised making any difference to improve community safety. In fact, the situation has got much worse. Children are committing serious crimes, sexual abuse is at a record high, juvenile crime and domestic crime and abuse is at a record high. When does the Prime Minister intend to visit Alice Springs?
Order.
Now, due to the last major flare-up in Alice Springs, as a way of trying to quell things in the hope that it would distract people from the Prime Minister's real hope for Indigenous affairs, and that, of course, was The Voice, that we spent $450 million and an entire year debating. It started as 60-40 yes, 60-40 hell no, after the Prime Minister's version of events, of course, were completely unconnected to the reality of what was happening in Alice Springs. It was January of last year when the Prime Minister spent more time in the air to and from Alice Springs than he spent on the ground. The press conference was supposed to be outside, but because they thought that they would end up getting trouble from locals, it was taken inside. The meetings were invite only. It was all picture opportunities with no real action, because the real priority of the Prime Minister was literally, after flying out of Alice Springs, you know exactly where he headed. Well, he ended up turning right, going down to Melbourne and playing with the plush set for a few days in a row at the Australian Open. Ice cream after ice cream seemed to be the only thing that he was interested in down there, as opposed to the urgent issues that were taking place in Alice Springs. Websites like news.com.au even noticed that there was a problem here, where the Prime Minister was spending more time with his feet up, getting cheers from the crowd that, of course, 12 months later turned to boos. Because the honeymoon was still on back then. Well, it's way over now, and the reality of governing is that this bloke does not like being forced to do the things that he doesn't want to do. Now, remember, his plan was for The Voice. Even the Northern Territory voted against The Voice. For that, Peter Dutton will forever be shamed by the left and this Prime Minister, who was, of course, playing for that moment in history. But what about this? As the first sign of the Prime Minister being right back into the angry elbow, the lost elbow, the tired elbow, the confused elbow, the disconnected elbow from the end of last year, the one that supposedly had been reborn for some too little too late tax cuts that, yes, got them over the line in a by-election, but the national numbers have got worse as if none of those tax changes had taken place at all. He was able to manage the headlines, not the reality of the lived experience of people in the Australian economy. And the Prime Minister does not like being asked questions that expose not only his glass jaw, but his lack of judgment. This was his response to the question that you have just seen asked by Peter Dutton.
A bloke who barely leaves his office, doesn't get out and about,
The member for Latrobe.
except for his Wednesday night appearance on Sky News.
Well, firstly, clearly not true. Peter Dutton gets around plenty, but it's not for me to defend him. But there is no regular Wednesday night appearance here on Sky News. Instead, the synopses were misfiring for the Prime Minister today. Now, he does weekly radio chats, including with my friend and colleague in Ray Hadley. He does pop up on Sky News, but there's no regular scheduled appearance here in Sky News primetime. Instead, the Prime Minister, you can see how easily triggered he is that he thinks issues like Alice Springs are ones that are made up by the people who hold him to account, and that largely in the media is us. It is this channel, it is these times of the night. The Prime Minister continuously tries to change the subject and tries to believe that he is fighting against a man in Peter Dutton who has no idea what's really going on in Australia. Well, of course, he was right on the Jobs Summit. He was right on The Voice. And I think, in terms of where the majority of Australians are, he is right on the concept of us wanting to move to nuclear power as a way of getting to zero emissions, as opposed to the millions of cables, windmills and solar farms, the solar farms of which, of course, largely made in China and made by slave labour. But the Prime Minister, desperate not to answer the question that he had been asked about a situation where his own citizens, it's an Indigenous Labor MP as well, the people who supposedly were the heart of the nation, but of course when the heart of the nation is bleeding, this Prime Minister, not interested. Instead, petty barbs like ones about Sky News, and then this rubbish as well.
As I said, I have been a regular visitor to the Northern Territory. I will continue to be a regular visitor to the Northern Territory, just as I suspect this bloke will be a continual regular visitor to Gina Rinehart's parties.
Seriously? It's the Prime Minister who also goes to billionaires' parties. Remember the one where that weekend where he was Taylor Swift one night and Katy Perry and the billionaires the other night? Now, we all know where Peter Dutton is when it comes to Alice Springs. He wants the kids taken care of and he wants people safe as well. And you want to talk about priorities? The Indigenous Affairs Minister, Linda Burney, has virtually disappeared since the election. The expectation is that she will get reshuffled up to be potentially the next Governor-General because she's such a failure. As for Peter Dutton, as for the opposition, their Indigenous Affairs spokesperson actually lives in Alice Springs. That, of course, is Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, who, quite rightly, was raging in Parliament today, action needed in Alice Springs. But we know, when it comes to the priorities, it's not about action in Alice Springs, it's about ice creams and the VIP section when it comes to this Prime Minister. Well, as I mentioned, today, the Chief Minister did something right in the Northern Territory. She announced a curfew for the next couple of weeks. It kicks in at 6 p.m. each and every night in Alice Springs.
The scenes that we saw last night and the scenes that we saw yesterday afternoon absolutely warrant us stepping up and stepping in around a curfew from 6 p.m. at night till 6 a.m. in the morning.